It's good to see you all. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our Zoom event. We are going to go ahead and get started since it is 12 o'clock. So my name is Alicia Tatum, and I am the Program Director of Religious Leaders here at the ICJS. I would like to welcome you to our discussion on race, trauma, and healing, insights from Jewish anti-racism practitioners. This event is hosted by the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. At ICJS, we recognize that we engage religious differences in a society marred by inequities rooted in race, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, abilities, socioeconomic status, and other differences. These inequities should have no influence on how we value each other. However, our religious traditions continue to be complicit in the perpetuation of these inequities. ICJS is committed to fostering a culture of equity and inclusion by creating learning communities where we have dialogue around the ways in which our religious traditions have both upheld and resisted these inequities. In today's conversation, we will hear from two leaders within the Baltimore community who are working towards racial equity and justice, guided by the values and principles within their religious traditions. So I would like to introduce both of them. I have learned so much from both of them in such a short amount of time meeting them. So I'm so excited that you all will be able to hear their wisdom and their experiences. So I would like to introduce Dr. Harriette Wimms. She is a Maryland licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in providing compassion-infused mental health care to children, adolescents, adults, and families. Harriette is a prayer leader in both the Kohenet community and at Hinenu. Harriette is also the inaugural Jews of Color Engagement Fellow at the Associated Baltimore Jewish Federation and the founder and executive director of the Jews of Color Mishpacha Project. So welcome, Dr. Harriette. And then I also want to introduce Tracie Guy-Decker. She is currently on sabbatical, both from her role as senior partner with Joyous Justice and as the co-host of the Joyous Justice podcast, formerly Jews Talk Racial Justice. She is a chair of the Social Justice Committee at Baltimore Hebrew Congregation and co-chair of the Baltimore Leadership Council of Jews United for Justice. Tracie, welcome. I am so glad that you both are here with us and so excited for the conversation that we are going to have today. I would ask everybody to mute themselves. There will be time for question and answers at the end of our conversation. And so if you do have questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll try to get to as many as we can after our conversation. So I would love for each of you to start by telling us about the work that you do within your community and how would you say your religion has shaped your views of justice and equity?
Thank you so much, Alicia. And it is such a true gift to be here with you and to be here with my beloved friend, Tracie, and chosen family member, Tracie. I think first of the words of Abraham Heschel, who indicated that we needed to pray with our feet, which was also a tenet of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so the work that I do really comes from a strong desire around healing the world, tikkun olam, and whether that is with individuals in my practice, whether that is leading ritual or supporting programming in religious spaces. What I'm trying to do is do my part toward healing the world. And that is also what led me to start and expand the Jews of Color Mishpacha Project. Mishpacha means family. And so finding ways to build chosen family, especially for Jewish people of color who often feel they are at the nexus of anti-Semitism and racism. And so that's how my work is informed by my religious practice.
Thank you. How about for you, Tracie?
Yeah, thanks. I want to echo Harriette's gratitude for this coming together, this convening. I think that my work, my passion for justice and equity is entirely informed by my understanding of Jewishness. In many ways, like I could spend the whole hour just talking about this. I won't. But yes, to Dr. Heschel, I think I'll try to sum it up. So there's Torah, which both in the literal scriptural sense and also in the sort of general sense, when Jews talk about Torah, we mean truth and guidance at the same time. And so from Torah, we are all created in God's image, all of us. It doesn't say Jews, or it doesn't say white people. It doesn't say, able-bodied people. It says all of us are created in God's image. So there's Torah. There's also history, right? Though we rightfully do not think of Judaism as a race today, for most of our existence, it was considered a race, and anti-Semitism was a form of racism that through which we suffered horribly. And so history and empathy is another one. And then the third is my experience that Jewishness is not a race anymore, if it ever truly was. And Jews come in all shapes and colors and ethnicities. And how can I, if I am to care about my sibling, how can I care about Harriette in the synagogue and not care what happens to her on the street? And the fourth and final is it's still in that experience category. What I have learned about my own faith tradition by being in community with people who look and worship differently than I do, but within the same tent, it's immeasurable. It's so amazing. It has so deepened and enriched my understanding of the world and myself and God and community and more, please. And again, so then that becomes a virtuous circle, because I'm enriched by being in family with Jews of color. And if they are my family, and they are, then I have to care about them, not only in the synagogue. I have lots more to say, but we have lots to talk about, so I'll stop.
Yes. Can I just lift up, please? See, this is why Tracie is my chosen family, because she walks that talk. And I also want to lift up what Tracie is saying needs to be part and parcel of the micro work and the macro work, right? Because it's nice to check off a box, really not nice, but it's nice to check off a box that says, okay, we have this person on our board. We have that person sitting in the seat. We have this person who we've reached out to. We've done our work. But if we can't turn off our Zoom, close our office, walk out to our car, get in our car and drive home, and we're not doing that same work in our homes and in our communities and in our lives, then it's not real.
Wow. Yes. Ooh, Dr. Harriette, thank you for that, because what you're sharing with us is it's more than checking off the box. It's more than the outside, what it looks like, because sometimes we can be diverse in look. And like you said, at home, we aren't teaching the lessons that we are all created in God's image. We are not speaking that, we're not living that. And so I thank you for even that challenge of, we have to get beyond checking the box and really do the inner work that's needed. So thank you for that. So you all are sharing with us how your religious values have shaped your work. I would love I know you could probably talk for hours about your journey towards social justice and the work that you do, but just give us a little glimpse of how you got into this work.
Yeah. Harriette and I decided ahead of time who would go first on which of these. So it's my turn. So I definitely had an inciting incident, which for me was the uprising in Baltimore after Freddie Gray was murdered. And I had a moment where, like the rest of the city and the rest of the country, I was watching that CVS burn on Penn and North, and I started to cry. And I was like really upset. And what I now know was divine intervention. At the time, and even for a year afterwards, I would never have said that God spoke to me. But I had this sense, these words come to me that I don't think were me, that said, a man is dead and you are crying because a pharmacy is burning. Something is wrong here. Many things are wrong here. And that moment just totally changed me. I was changed. I was ashamed. And I felt a fire that was lit in me that continues to burn. And I'll just leave with one additional metaphor that I recently learned from Audre Lorde in her uses of the erotic. I'm not going to talk about erotic, but she talks about, she uses this metaphor of during World War II, I guess, margarine, like that we would get margarine from, as a ration, and it would come just as like the white shortening, and it would have like a little pellet of yellow that was like really vibrant, and you would have to knead the yellow into the shortening to make it yellow. And she uses that as an example of like trying to work in the embodied in our lives. I'm realizing that was me with thinking about racial justice. And in those first couple of years, I was like, look, there's yellow. Look at that yellow pellet. I have a yellow pellet. There it is. There it is. There it is. And I was like really, really urgent. And I needed everyone to know. I needed to be acknowledged that I had this yellow. Mm-hmm. And in the time since then, as I keep going and I keep showing up and I keep making mistakes and hurting people again and making repair for the hurt and finding new ways to be and to show up, I'm needing that yellow through my being, so that, like Harriette says, I'm not just checking a box by saying, yep, there it is. I'm actually working it through, which is not to say I don't make mistakes anymore. I totally do. And they don't destroy me in the same way that they did before. And I'm able to just come to my friend or to my partner or to the stakeholder and say, whew, okay, I made a mistake. Let's figure out how to fix this. How can I make it right? Or whatever the right next step is. So that metaphor from Audre Lorde's essay, I just read it a couple of weeks ago, and it's really been rattling around in my head in many ways, but as something that I'm thinking about as a model for the way that change happens in a human and how we show up.
Oh, thank you for that. Oh,
woo. Amen. Asheva, amen. Wow. My dad was 60 when I was born. My mom was 46. And both of them experienced absolute cruelty, the cruelty of racism in the United States during their lifetimes. My father fought in World War II. And so I grew up hearing so many stories about World War II. And when I was a teenager, back when I knew everything, that I could have just the tiniest bit of that today, I told them racism no longer existed. I understood about the water fountains and all of it, and the sundown towns. Yes, and KKK, I get it. And that doesn't exist anymore. And I wish that they were alive today so that I could make amends. And so I think that one of the things that I do is I make amends with my life. hoping that one day I will see them again and I'll say, okay, you were right, I was wrong. Both and we can work toward a place where racism is eradicated, social injustice is eradicated. And so that's how I got to my place. I also strongly believe that once we are a witness to injustice, speaking to that moment that Tracie had where the divine spoke to her, I've had those moments before. And once we witness, I truly believe, once I witness, then I have a responsibility to make change happen. And if not, then I'm part of the problem.
Ooh, thank you so much for that. And I just want to repeat that. Once I am a witness, I am responsible for making change. And I really believe for the nation, for the world, May 25th, 2020 was a turning point for a lot of people. Tracie, like you said, it was the uprising after Freddie Gray's death. For you, Dr. Harriette, thinking about the stories your parents told you about racism that you didn't necessarily believe, but you're now making amends. We all have these turning points. And I just think collectively, us watching George Floyd be killed was the turning point. And I would love for you all to reflect, how did that moment change the trajectory of your work? Was there an even deeper sense of a call for you, as there was a call for this nation to address systemic racism? How did that actually shape your work?
So I have started calling the death of Black people at the hands of police, I'm calling it lynching. And I was lucky enough in the spring to go to the EJI, Equal Justice Initiative's lynching memorial. So lynching is not new. What's new is, and I had no idea I was going to be as emotional as I am today, so I want to apologize for that. What's new is that now we can watch it on social media. So that's one thing. And it's disgusting. Secondly, I say with love, for me, and for a number of other Black people and Black Jews, all of a sudden our white friends, colleagues, they turned around and realized we were Black. Mm-hmm. And so I started getting emails saying, I hope you're okay. Mm-hmm. My grandmother was almost lynched by the KKK. That history, I'm not okay with that. And I wasn't okay on May 25th, 2020. And there are things that I'm not okay with right now. Not only did I all of a sudden become Black, but then I was called to all of a sudden do DEI work. I'm a psychologist. Luckily, I'm also a social psychologist, so I had that in my back pocket. But there are people who are economists, and they were being reached out to do DEI work with no budget. Oof. And it's still happening right now. So I implore those who are listening, what can you do? Just like Tracie said a little while ago, right? What can you do to right that wrong? Because it's perpetuating.
Yeah. So not long after George Floyd's death, I actually started working at Joyous Justice with April Baskin, who's another Black Jew who does DEI work. And that, June of 2020, she refers to as the deluge, because it was like, every Jewish organization on the planet decided, oh, we gotta do DEI work, which is wonderful. And also a lot like sort of pointing at that yellow pellet. And unfortunately, what I'm seeing in the field is that instead of needing that color into the white shortening, folks are sort of forgetting, or like losing, like organizations at least are sort of losing interest. Maybe it's that they checked those boxes that Harriette spoke about in the very beginning and think that they're done, and obviously they're not. So the way that shapes my work, it's not quite the way I think you were thinking, Alicia. There was certainly a moment of reinvigoration and even hopefulness, as like, you're walking down the street and hearing people talk about systemic racism for the first time ever. That was not a term that ordinary folks were talking about. And so in that sense, in terms of consciousness raising, it felt like a turning point. And here we are, only 3 years later. And I feel like, given the backlash, because white supremacy is so well guarded, are we actually better off? And that's what I don't want to overstate, because I'm not giving up. I'm not suggesting that we should give up. It's not despair, but I'm trying to have a realistic sense of what our work is. And I think it is not that we sort of open the floodgate and now we just walk toward the beloved community. It is a much more circuitous and treacherous path.
Yes. You talked about there was a reinvigoration, but now 3 years later, there is this sense of, okay, we've checked that box. We've had our DEI trainings, and unfortunately, we are seeing some backlash. I would love for you all to think about, what role does addressing intergenerational trauma play into all of this? And I'm kind of wondering if there's a need to actually address that trauma. Dr. Harriette, when you talk about, we've had lynching, now we're just able to see the lynching. What's the trauma that comes up from constantly, because we know even since George Floyd's lynching, there have been other killings of Black people. What would you say is the importance of actually addressing this intergenerational trauma due to racism in this social justice work? And what are the repercussions if we don't?
Yeah, it's essential. I mean, I'm going to paraphrase because I don't have the quote right in front of me, but Resmaa Menakem says that trauma decontextualized in an individual looks like personality. Trauma decontextualized in a family looks like family patterns. And trauma decontextualized in a people looks like culture. And I think the truth of that statement, the Torah of that statement, is what we need to recognize, right? Because so thinking about white Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, there are other white Jews who aren't Ashkenazi, but specifically Ashkenazi Jews and Black folks, right? In terms of each of our collective our collective trauma from the past, right? So for Jews in Europe, a pogrom could come up like that, right? So we had to be ready to move immediately if we were going to survive. It was a survival strategy that worked. Urgency. For enslaved Black folks, urgency wasn't going to help. Patience. biding your time, waiting for the right moment. And so when our two cultures try to work together to address the reality that we've been discussing for the past 25 minutes, right? And white Jews, from our ancestral patterns, our ancestral best practices that kept us alive. White Jews, we gotta move. Let's do something now. Well, that triggers the trauma patterns in our Black partners who, if you were, being rushed, especially if you're being rushed and you don't have full agency, right? That's no, like that's going to create a barrier between those two people.
There they go again. There go those white people again, telling us what to do. Oh my gosh, Tracie, preach, honey.
Well, and that's the two natural allies when we're fighting white supremacy. We're not even talking about the trauma that and the harm that has been done to the non-Jewish white folks whose grandfathers were doing the lynching. Because dehumanization and trauma hurts everyone, including the dehumanizer. Because think about what parts of your brain and your soul you have to be able to turn off in order to do that. Yes. And so, which is not to say like I'm out there like ready to go out and hug a KKK member. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that like trauma, if we can actually put trauma in our sights as the enemy and that historic trauma that needs to be healed, instead of that individual who is now playing out old trauma patterns. I'm not saying we should forgive harm, so don't take it too far, but let's remember that like racist is an action, it's not a human. Yes. Harriette.
Whoa. Yeah. Oh my gosh, like I need to write a book with you.
I want to read that book.
I am in.
Another piece for this, for me, is the realization that trauma impacts DNA.
Yes.
So I am in this moment, part of me is reliving when I am othered, when there is an ism, the trauma of the Middle Passage, of my people being stolen from Africa and sold in the United States and beyond. I also want to lift up, and I'm not trivializing the tremendous weight of that trauma, this idea of post-traumatic growth.
Yes.
That if we can actually see the trauma, say the trauma, work through it, and understand that it is multi-level because it's intergenerational, we all collectively can get to a point and a place of healing. And then imagine the social change that happens when we are functioning not from a place of reactivity, but choice and action. I had a friend who was the grandchild of Holocaust victims who had money hidden all over the house just in case. And this person didn't experience that pain, but heard about it through grandparents. And it became part of their lived experience. So we have to be able to compassionately explore trauma, lift it up, address it, make spaces truly, there's no such thing as a safe space, but brave, so that we can move to the healing and move to post-traumatic growth as individuals, as families, as communities, as cultures.
Yes. As you all are sharing about the importance of actually addressing this intergenerational trauma, it makes me wonder if the reason why we're seeing some of that backlash, some of the I'm just going to check the box, the lack of interest or motivation is we haven't actually addressed the intergenerational trauma. And so we continue in this cycle. And then until we do this important work, we are going to find ourselves in this perpetual cycle.
Go ahead,
Dr. Harriette, go ahead.
I had an opportunity to listen to two Black elders, two women, talk about growing up in Baltimore. And for them, along Park Heights Avenue, when it got to Northern Parkway, they knew they weren't allowed to cross into the north. One of the things I want to do, and I'm lifting this up if there are people who are interested, is I'd like to build a program where we listen to the stories of elder women who are Black and not Jewish, who are white Jews, and JOC elder women in Baltimore. Right? That's part of the healing. There are stories that aren't necessarily being listened to because of true intersectionality, right? What Crenshaw was saying, being women, being elders, being Jews, being Black. How often are our stories truly being held? And I think that when we can get that deep learning from people with such wisdom, that will be another step forward.
Thank you so much. There's power in our stories, and it would be interesting to even have an intergenerational space where our children can hear those stories, where they can gain that wisdom. Because I believe that is also where that healing takes place. When you hear, wait a minute, my mother went through that, my grandmother went through that. How can we stop some of these cycles we find ourselves in? So I love that, Dr. Harriette. And again, if anybody is interested in that, we would love to know how to curate that. That's wonderful. Oh, so we have a couple more minutes, and I want to get to maybe two more questions. I do want to encourage the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box so that we can get to as many as we can. But the second to last question I do want to ask is, I want you all to share a time with the audience where you've worked with individuals or communities from different religious backgrounds on issues of justice, and how has that experience been?
Harriette, I think this was one you were going to start.
Wonderful, thank you. I love that you knew that I was looking to you, Tracie, even though we're on the Zoom. That's so interesting. I can recall after Tree of Life, after the massacre of the Tree of Life, people were encouraged to come to Shabbat, to come to services that Friday night as a show of solidarity, shared grief. And when I walked into the shul, interestingly, we meet at Friends Meeting House. And so when I walked into the shul that on other days is a Friends Meeting House, there were Muslim allies standing outside to make sure that we would be safe during our service. That didn't just happen overnight. That is because there had been, and there is, a focus within my spiritual community of collaboration and connection across beliefs. And that's truly how we get to the world to come, is that our tent has to grow ever wider and has to be vibrantly multicolored in order for all of us to get to those sacred spaces of bliss.
Thank you.
The things that are coming to mind actually are from fairly early after the uprising, after my sort of, when I was still kind of holding that yellow pellet and looking for recognition for it, but starting to need it into my being. And in fact, ICJS provided an opportunity for me. I was among the first Imagining Justice in Baltimore fellows. And I was still figuring out how to talk about all this and metabolizing it. It was in 2016, but learning and talking with other folks of faith who cared deeply about what I cared deeply about was really, really powerful for me. And honestly, it showed me, actually, many of my fellows showed me role models for how to talk about this work unapologetically as a religious work. Because as a Jew, especially from within the Reform tradition, which grew out of German Enlightenment and still holds on to that sort of like very rational kind of outlook on life, like we don't talk about God very much. Like maybe in the synagogue, maybe, but with discomfort and like with an apology. Like it's not a thing that most Reform Jews comfortably just, talk about. And so for me too, even though I went to divinity school at the University of Chicago with several ICJS staff actually, but even there, like we talked about God all the time, but God was like a concept or a character. Like God was not an entity with whom we had a relationship. But you remember I told you earlier, like I had heard God's voice in that moment or something like that. Anyway, my colleagues in that ICJS fellowship really gave me models for how to do this work as a person of faith without apology, and just to show up in that truth that divinity, that faith, that religion plays a major role in how and why I show up. And I don't need to apologize for that. And I don't need to put an asterisk. And if you want to buy me a beer, I'll explain to you what I mean by God, because it's not that giant old man in the sky. But I don't need to do that in order to get permission to talk about it. And I really learned that from my Christian and Muslim colleagues in that fellowship.
Thank you so much. So I have one last question before we get to our audience questions. I know that this work can be overwhelming at times. I know, Tracie, you talked about we don't want to go into despair. We also don't want to get to a place of just checking boxes because we are worn out. We are exhausted. If you are a person of color, you are the one that's getting the invitations to do DEI work, and that's not what you do for your regular job. So it can get overwhelming. But I would love for you all to share with us, where have you experienced hope? And are there practices within your religious tradition that really sustain you and your community and sustain this hope, even while we continue to see people of color getting killed, even as we continue to see bans on books, even as we continue to see laws getting, even as we continue to see the injustices? What anchors you? Where have you experienced hope? And what are the practices that you are using, your community is using to really sustain that hope?
And over the last 3 years, I have experienced moments of hopelessness. And I'm lifting up Tracie, who one day needed challah, baked it, brought it to my house, brought me back into Jewish community when I was isolating. When a person is grieving in Jewish space, they stand up to say the prayer of mourning, Kaddish. And it's a powerful thing because it lets everybody gathered know this person may need a little extra support. This person may need a little bringing in. And it's brave also to stand up and say, I'm grieving. What brings me hope then is the power of community. And the power to reach out to people who are feeling like the stranger and to bring them back in. There's a beloved person on this call who I happened to text them, and I noticed that they had sent me a text a couple of weeks back that just said, "Hi, friend." Those are sacred moments when we reach out to others who we know may be needing a little bit of divinity, of connection. And I think it's person by person, that's where the hope comes from. My mother used to say, everybody deserves the time of day. Everybody deserves to be seen and held as a divine image of God. So that's where I see hope.
Thank you.
Not surprisingly, I'm in a similar place where community is, and in fact, I was going to bring up grieving as well, because so there are certain prayers that are considered the holiest prayers in the prayer book, and the holiest prayer you can only say if you have a community, if you have a minimum number of other prayers, and the Mourner's Kaddish is one of those. Grieving is holy work, and we need community for it. And so I take a lot from that. I think especially in American culture, like that obligation that we talked about earlier, we take that on as individuals, but this is not an individual problem, and no one person is going to be able to solve it. And so countering that isolation, that our culture is all about the rugged individual. That is what American culture is built on. So we have to really be a little countercultural as social justice pursuers, because it's not going to be fixed by one person. And so community, and those, both the minimum congregation, but also, as Harriette's talking about, those individual connections. And one of the things too for me that I've talked about, Alicia, you've heard me talk about this before, but in terms of practices, for me, I have adapted and adopted the traditional practice of saying a blessing. There are prescriptions for all kinds of blessings in the Talmud of what, and in later Jewish literature, of what we're supposed to say when we eat, after we use the bathroom, if we see a rainbow, when we see a friend we haven't seen for a long time, when we wake up, when we go to sleep, like all there, you're supposed to say at least 100 a day. I don't say 100 a day, but I use that as a way to think about moments that I want to mark and not ignore, that I want to be fully present to. And that can be both for the good, like an amazing peach when they're in season, but it can also be for the bad because Freddie Gray, George Floyd, like they're just two of too many. And we're going to have more. That headline, I cannot abide that headline would have come across my phone and I would say, oh, that's sad. I wonder what I'm going to have for dinner. And so that's a moment that I decided I wanted to mark. So I use a blessing the rabbis gave us, actually, for that we say, traditional Jews say every day, blessed is God who enlivens the dead. So I say that blessing in Hebrew. When that happens, it makes me pause for just 5 seconds to not be numb, but also not despair. And finding that line that is not desensitization, but is also not like complete despair and giving up. Finding that line over and over and over again is what we need to do. So that's just one. I have lots, but I wanted to share that as a specific Jewish practice that I have adopted as my own, specifically for my social justice practice, my social justice spiritual activism, if you will. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And you all are like helping us to think about whatever your tradition is, what are those practices that ground you? And as you all were talking, I was thinking about, we often think of community as a noun or a place, but the practice of community, of being able to reach out to each other and say, I'm just not feeling it today. Or have somebody else reach out to you when you're grieving. And so just being in community as a spiritual practice is powerful. So I appreciate you all both lifting that up and even sharing the blessing. There's so much. There's so much. But I want to get to our audience questions. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. I do have several here, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. But the first question is, do you recommend any readings, preferably for high school level, that might address intergenerational trauma and help our youth understand this complex concept? And that's for either Tracie or Dr. Harriette.
Wow. So Dr. Kendi had Stacked from the Beginning adapted for young adults by Jason Reynolds. I definitely think that is worth reading, and it's written sort of in the vernacular of young people. I initially read it thinking maybe I could share it with something as like more easily digestible than Stacked is such a tome. It is not for my generation. It's not. It's not written in our vernacular. So and I think because Dr. Kendi talked about sort of the whole history of racism, I think there's some of that. The thing that I recommend, which I don't know if it's for high school students, if you are an educator, I want you to watch it first. But Dr. Joy DeGruy, there's a lecture of hers on YouTube. It's long. Probably like an hour and 45 minutes, called just search Dr. Joy DeGruy post-traumatic slave syndrome, where she really breaks it down and how it shows up, like a much more involved version of the nutshell that I gave. It's really beautiful. There's also a short version from her that actually could be for high school students. Dr. Joy DeGruy, it's like a 5-minute from the AJ video. It's like a much quicker explanation of how that shows up. Those are my offerings.
Right. I think that's a phenomenal question. And I really want to lift up again the Equal Justice Initiative, the podcasts by Brian Stevenson, a road trip to Alabama. I feel like on a trip that I made over a weekend, I earned a second PhD in information that had never, ever been privy to me. And so I can't lift up his work, the movie, the podcast, the books, as resources.
Right, thank you. Similar to kind of some resource sharing, I have a question in the chat. They said one of the things that Tracie mentioned was that dehumanization and trauma hurts everyone. This was one of the most powerful learnings I had when I did the People's Institute anti-racism training. I wonder what ideas or resources you might have to share specifically about that message, that dehumanization and trauma hurts us all, so that all of us realize that we all have a part in getting to healing.
I'd like to lift up Inside Out Wisdom and Actions, Dismantling Racism from the Inside Out. It can be Googled by searching that, that conglomeration of words, or DRIO, D-R-I-O, and Yehuda Webster. And they have a curriculum around Jewish practices, texts, and Musar, which is a practice of lifting ourselves to become our best selves, specifically around dismantling racism.
I'd also point back again to Brian Stevenson's work in terms of the dehumanization of everyone. He tells a story about at the museum that Harriette mentioned. They have jars of earth from sites of lynching, and he tells a story about a woman who was gathering earth, and then a Black woman and a white man came and asked what she was doing, and then he started helping, like with his bare hands, and then he was crying. And by the end, it turns out that he thinks probably his family participated in the lynching, and he needed to do some healing. So I think Stevenson has done work and thinking and research about that piece of it, that the ways in which the perpetrators are also dehumanized.
Thank you. This might be our last question. Somebody wrote, I'm angry and saddened about what is going on in Florida regarding the banning of teaching AP African American Studies. I feel anger that this is happening, but also sadness for the children who are being denied this knowledge of history. How do you respond to the statements from those that deny this teaching based on the thinking that they are protecting their children from guilt, feeling less than?
You want me to take this, Harriette, or do you want to start?
I just want to say those who do not know our past are destined to relive it.
Oof. Mm.
I have one other thing I got to say, Tracie.
Yeah.
That my connection with the Equal Justice Initiative left me so PO'd because my history was systematically denied me, such that when my parents were telling me stories, I couldn't put it in context. So what we have happening in Florida, not just that, but I'm going to tone it down. There's a lot going on across this country that ain't cool. It's also not new. This time we just actually have the capacity to be able to see what's happening.
Right.
So let's figure out how it was undone in the past so we can do it right now. Be pissed, be angry, grieve, and then act.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think in the conversations with the individuals, like if that's what the question from the audience member is, like two things immediately occurred to me. One, what children are you protecting? You're not protecting the Black and brown children by banning this history,
or the white kids,
yeah. And even that you think you're protecting the white kids is based on a fallacy, right? I said earlier, let's remember that racist is an action, not a person, and that's really what I want to. That's really my answer to this question, is that we have been taught falsely that there are good and bad people. Racism is bad. I'm not a bad person, therefore I can't be racist. It's much more nuanced than that, right? Dr. Kendi teaches that individuals aren't racist, actions, thoughts, and behaviors are. And so I can, in one day, in 1 hour, in 15 minutes, I can say anti-racist things and do racist things. both can be true. The individual, this is where our religion comes in. Our religions teach us that our souls, that we are made in God's image, are inherently pure, inherently good, and that is incorruptible. Bad things can be layered on top of that. Oh, sorry, hit the mic. Racism is one of those things. It's dirt. It's on us. It's not us. And so we don't need to protect those white kids from feeling guilty. We need to teach them that dirt and sludge and filth can obscure and hide our goodness, and that we can wipe it away and cleanse ourselves by rehumanizing each other. So the fundamental fallacy of the good-bad binary is what is completely driving this desire to so-called protect the white kids from feeling guilty. It's that there are good and bad people. You're not, and racists are bad people, and you're a good person, therefore you can't be racist. That is a false conclusion.
And I don't know about what kids are in Florida, but if they're kids like the children of my child or Tracie's child, or a lot of the kids that I work with, they are most definitely informed, and they're going to learn it whether they get it in school or hear it on TikTok. There's no silencing it. And this generation is not putting up with the junk.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. I know we could go on for hours, and I'm sorry for those questions I did not get to. I also want to thank those who actually put their information in the chat box. Dr. Harriette, you have people that are interested in your interviewing narrative project, so I will make sure to pass that information along to you. But I just want to thank you all so much for this enriching conversation. Every time I talk to both of you, I'm taking notes. I'm, putting down the resources that you're sharing. And I'm grateful that you continue to share your wisdom with a larger community, because we need to hear it. And not only the wisdom, I know that you all have a relationship. And I think that's what makes these conversations so powerful. You all are walking witnesses of what you're talking about. And so I appreciate you so much. For those who have joined this conversation, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you have been enriched by this conversation. I also hope, if you are involved in social justice initiatives in your community, that this conversation has energized you and has offered you some insight so that you can continue this work. So we would love to hear from you. We always appreciate feedback from our participants. And so when this Zoom closes, you're actually going to receive a prompt to do a survey. We ask that you would do the survey right away while everything is fresh in your mind, while the insights and the wisdom that has been shared is right in the forefront, because we would love to hear from you. Your feedback actually helps us as we are going forward doing our programming. And we would love for you to visit our website. It's very easy. ICJS.org. If you would like to donate or subscribe to our email list or learn about our upcoming programs. ICJS is a non-sectarian and independent. We're unaffiliated with any academic or religious organization, and we are supported by people like you. The program that Tracie talked about, it's because of the donations and the wonderful donors that we get that we can do programs like that. And so we encourage you to donate if you can. And as you see, our programming, there is no cost to our programming. And so we definitely appreciate the support. And also, if you're not already receiving our email newsletter, we invite you to sign up to learn about our upcoming programs. And this summer, we are going to be taking a little pause, but we will be back in the fall. We are so excited that we will have our Mannequin Clark lecture starting in September. Our lecturer is Dr. Walter Fluker. He is the Dean's Professor of Spirituality, Ethics, and Leadership at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. University, and he is the editor of the Howard Thurman Papers. And so September 27th, we will have a Howard Thurman documentary viewing and discussion. And in October, we will have a Howard Thurman course and also a book study for religious leaders. And then on October 23rd, it will be open to the public, our Mannequin Clark lecture by Dr. Earl Fluker. And if you are not tired of us yet, we invite you to join in November, where we're going to have another public study group on some of the writings of Howard Thurman, as well as Dr. Fluker. And so we thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again in the fall.